Most people think of trauma as something you would know you had. A major event, something dramatic, something that would be obviously difficult, obvious to you, obvious to others, something you would be able to point to and say that right there, that is what affected me. But trauma, the way researchers and clinicians now understand it, is not defined by the event. It is defined by what happens inside, by what the nervous system does when an experience is too overwhelming, too sudden, too threatening, or too isolating to be fully processed, by what gets stored in the body when an experience exceeds the system's capacity to integrate it at the time. And what that means is that trauma can live in a person long after the event is over, long after they've moved on, rebuilt, and gotten on with their lives. Not as a memory they're dwelling on, but as a set of automatic responses, habits, ways of being, the things they do without knowing exactly why. Today we're looking at 10 normal habits that are actually signs of unhealed trauma. Not to alarm, not to pathologize the ordinary, but because the habits on this list are running for a reason, and understanding that reason is the beginning of having a choice about them. If any of these feel uncomfortably familiar, if your first response is a kind of recognition rather than curiosity, this video might be for you. Trauma, in the clinical sense, is not a synonym for something very bad that happened. It is a specific physiological process, the way the nervous system responds when an experience exceeds its capacity to process and integrate at the time. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, whose research transformed how we understand trauma, described it this way: the body keeps the score. The brain doesn't always hold the full story of what happened, but the body, the nervous system, the automatic behavioral patterns that were laid down in response to the overwhelming experience, those keep running, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. Unhealed trauma is not necessarily active suffering. It is the nervous system still running its protective protocols in response to a threat that may no longer be present. The habits on this list are not symptoms of weakness. They are the output of a system that is still trying, with tremendous consistency, to keep you safe. Let's look at what that looks like. Habit 1. Waiting for the other shoe to drop. Something good happens, and rather than simply experiencing the good thing, some part of you immediately starts looking for the problem, the catch, the thing that is going to make this not as good as it appears. The relationship is going well, which means it could end. The job is going well, which means you could lose it. The moment is good, which means it's temporary. And temporary good things in a nervous system shaped by experiences of unpredictable loss or harm feel less like gifts and more like setups. This is called anticipatory anxiety, the chronic low-level preparation for bad things to happen even when nothing is currently wrong. And it is one of the most common features of unprocessed trauma, particularly trauma that involved unpredictability. Environments where things change suddenly, where good things were followed by bad things without warning, where the gap between okay and not okay was crossed with very little notice. The habit of waiting for the other shoe to drop is not pessimism. It is a nervous system that learned in a real environment that good things are often followed by bad ones. And it is still applying that learning helpfully, faithfully, exhaustingly to a present that may no longer require it. Habit 2. Overexplaining and over-apologizing, especially in conflict. When someone seems upset with you, or when there is any friction in an interaction, something activates. And the response is not to simply state your position, or ask what's going on, or wait for more information. The response is to explain. Thoroughly, more than the situation requires, to provide so much context, so much justification, so much preemptive acknowledgement of every possible way you might have gotten this wrong, that by the end of the explanation, the other person sometimes isn't sure what you were actually trying to say, and to apologize, sometimes for things you didn't do, or things that aren't your fault, or things that simply happened, because the apology feels like the thing that will make the conflict stop, that will lower the temperature, that will make you safe again. This pattern develops in environments where conflict was dangerous, where being wrong or accused or simply in the way when someone was angry had consequences, where the fastest and most reliable way to make the threat stop was to become as small and as accommodating as possible as quickly as possible. The over-explanation and the over-apology are not character flaws. They are the fawn response, the nervous system's attempt to resolve a perceived threat through appeasement, and they continue running in low-stakes situations because the system has not yet learned to distinguish between the situations that required them and the ones that don't. Habit 3. Difficulty resting, feeling guilty or anxious when not being productive. You sit down to rest, and within minutes, or sometimes seconds, something activates, a sense of unease, the feeling that you should be doing something, guilt that is disproportionate to the actual stakes of resting, an anxiety that doesn't resolve until you're moving again, doing again, producing again. Resting feels unsafe. Not in a way you could necessarily explain, but in a felt sense. The stillness is uncomfortable in a way that movement isn't, and so you fill the stillness, often without quite choosing to. This difficulty with rest has several possible roots in unprocessed trauma. In many traumatic environments, particularly those involving emotional unsafety at home, being visible and occupied was safer than being still. Being busy was a way of avoiding attention. Rest in those environments was either not available or actively unsafe. The moment the guard came down, something happened. For others, rest feels unearned, the product of an environment in which worth was conditional on productivity, in which you had to be doing something to justify your place. And the body learned, stillness is not safe. Movement is. The inability to rest is not laziness in reverse. It is a nervous system that never learned that it was allowed to stop. Habit 4. Intense reactions to things that seem small. The outsized response. Something happens. Something objectively minor. A tone of voice, a specific word, someone being late, something not going as planned, and the reaction is larger than the situation seems to call for. You might notice it as it's happening. The reaction feels bigger than it should be. You might feel embarrassed by it afterward, apologizing for the intensity, explaining that you don't know why it hit you so hard, because it doesn't make sense in terms of what just happened, but it makes complete sense in terms of what happened before. Trauma researchers call this a trauma trigger or a somatic reminder, a current-day experience that shares enough sensory or emotional features with a past overwhelming experience that the nervous system responds as though the past experience is happening again. The nervous system is not evaluating the current situation rationally. It is pattern matching. And the pattern it found is associated with a response that was necessary once, even if it's not necessary now. The outsized reaction is not evidence of being unstable or out of control. It is evidence of a nervous system that is working very hard to protect you from something it has not yet been told is over. Habit 5. Checking out. Going through the motions while mentally elsewhere. You're in a conversation. You're at an event. You're with people you care about. And somewhere in the middle of it, you're not entirely there, not choosing to be elsewhere, not distracted in the ordinary way, but genuinely less present than the situation calls for, in a way that takes effort to reverse. This is dissociation, the psychological mechanism by which the mind creates distance from an experience that is overwhelming or activating, At clinical levels, it can produce significant gaps in awareness or memory. At the subclinical levels most people experience, it is the low-grade checking out that happens when something in the present environment activates the nervous system enough that the body starts creating protective distance. Dissociation developed as a survival mechanism. In situations where what was happening could not be escaped physically, the mind created a different kind of distance, a way of not being fully in an experience that was too much to be fully in. That mechanism, once established, doesn't only activate in situations that require it. It activates in any situation that resembles them closely enough. If you sometimes notice that you have arrived somewhere and can't remember getting there, or that conversations happened that you were technically present for but can't fully recall, or that you regularly feel like you're watching your life from slightly outside it, that is worth paying attention to. Not with alarm, but with curiosity. Habit 6. People-pleasing and difficulty. Saying no. The request arrives. You assess it and recognize somewhere clearly that you don't want to do this. That saying yes will cost you something, that no is the accurate answer. And you say yes, not always, not to everything, but often enough, and to things important enough that the pattern is recognizable. The yes that wasn't freely chosen. The accommodation made out of anxiety about the consequences of not accommodating. The no that never quite formed, or that formed and then got edited before it reached the other person. People-pleasing in its chronic form is not a personality trait. It is a survival strategy that developed in an environment where other people's comfort and approval were conditions of safety, where saying no had consequences, where the smoothest path through a potentially volatile situation was to become as agreeable, as useful, as non-threatening as possible. The body learned. Disagreement creates danger. Agreement creates safety. And it runs that equation with remarkable consistency. In low-stakes situations, in relationships where the stakes are genuinely low, in interactions where no would be completely fine and wouldn't result in any consequences at all. The difficulty is not that you don't know what you want. The difficulty is that the system responsible for saying what you want is still running the old calculation. And in that calculation, honesty was never worth the risk. Habit 7. Difficulty receiving positive attention, deflecting compliments, downplaying success. Someone says something genuinely positive about you, compliments your work, acknowledges something you've done. And the response is not to simply receive it. You deflect. Oh, it wasn't that good. You minimize. Anyone could have done it. You pivot. What about what you did? You find the thing that was wrong with the thing they praised. You make yourself smaller than the acknowledgement would make you. And sometimes, if someone is very warm or very generous, you feel a specific discomfort, a kind of exposure, a vulnerability in being seen positively that can feel almost more uncomfortable than criticism. This has a specific origin. Environments where positive attention was not safe, where being noticed or praised created a target, drew attention that sometimes turned negative, or created expectations that then became sources of failure, or environments where positive attention simply wasn't available, and the system never developed the capacity to receive it, never learned the neural pathway from "someone is being warm to me" to "I can let this land." The inability to receive genuine positive attention is one of the more confusing features of unhealed trauma, because it looks like humility from the outside. It is not humility. It is a nervous system that learned that being seen was not entirely safe. Habit 8. Hyperawareness of other people's moods and needs. You know how everyone around you is doing before they tell you. You've read the quality of the silence, the pace of the greeting, the specific tension in the way someone set their coffee down. You've already assessed the emotional weather of the room and made preliminary calculations about how to navigate it. This is not a personality trait. It is a skill, a very specific, very sophisticated, very well-developed skill that was built in an environment where reading other people accurately was essential, where getting it wrong had consequences, where the ability to detect a shift in another person's mood before it became an explicit problem was the difference between navigating safely and not. The hyperawareness is real, and it is often genuinely useful in adult life. Many people who carry it are extraordinarily empathic, attuned to others in ways that make them excellent friends, colleagues, partners. The cost is the exhaustion of the monitoring, the ongoing expenditure of energy on assessments that may not always be necessary, and the specific pattern that often accompanies it, being attuned to everyone else's needs while having very little access to your own. The most sensitive person in the room is often the person who grew up needing to be. Habit 9. Avoiding anything that could result in rejection or failure. There is something you want, something that matters to you, and between you and the thing you want is the possibility of failure, the possibility of rejection, of not being good enough, of trying and having the trying produce a result that confirms the worst thing you believe about yourself. And so you don't try, or you try in a way that is small enough not to really count, that leaves room for the explanation that you didn't really put in full effort, so the result doesn't tell you anything definitive about your worth. Avoidance of failure and rejection, in its chronic form, is not about lacking ambition or confidence. It is the nervous system protecting the person from an experience it associates with something worse than the disappointment of failure, the collapse of self-worth that, in an earlier environment, used to accompany it. In environments where failure was treated as a reflection of who you are rather than what you did, where rejection confirmed fears about your fundamental worth rather than simply indicating a mismatch, the system learned to avoid the risk of failure more urgently than it pursued the reward of success. The avoidance is not a character flaw. It is a very rational response to a threat that used to be very real. The work is in slowly, gently demonstrating to the nervous system that the current stakes are different from the historical ones, and that you can survive outcomes that once felt unsurvivable. Habit 10. Feeling like you are always waiting for something bad to happen. Everything is fine. Nothing is wrong. By any reasonable assessment, the current moment is safe and okay, and yet, there is a low-level hum of anticipation, a sense of something waiting. Not quite dread, not quite fear, more like a vigilance that never quite turns off, a state of readiness that continues even when nothing requires readiness. The inability to fully inhabit the good moment, because some part of the system is still on duty, still scanning, still waiting for the signal that it's time to respond. This is hypervigilance, the chronic activation of the threat detection system that develops when an environment was unpredictable or unsafe. When you could not rely on things being okay, the nervous system made the reasonable decision to never assume they were, to always stay slightly alert, to never fully relax into safety, because the last time you did, something happened. Hypervigilance is one of the most exhausting features of unhealed trauma precisely because it is so invisible from the outside. The person experiencing it looks fine. They are functioning. They are often highly competent. The alertness that characterizes hypervigilance can produce impressive performance, but underneath the functioning, there's a system running at a level of activation that was designed for emergencies in a life that is no longer an emergency. Telling yourself to relax doesn't work. Deciding to stop waiting for something bad doesn't work. Not because you're not trying, but because hypervigilance is not a decision. It is a nervous system state. And nervous system states change not through willpower, but through accumulated experience of genuine safety, slowly, over time with patience. 10 habits, each of them completely ordinary, each of them running for a reason. I want to be very clear about something before we close. None of these habits is evidence that something is permanently wrong with you. They are evidence that something happened, something that was big enough, or sudden enough, or sustained enough, or isolating enough, that your system responded, and is still responding. That response was intelligent. It was appropriate. Your nervous system did exactly what a nervous system is supposed to do when an experience exceeds its capacity to integrate. It adapted. It developed strategies. It found ways to keep you moving, functioning, surviving in a situation that required that of it. The problem is not that the strategies were wrong. The problem is that they are still running in situations that no longer require them, that the nervous system has not yet received enough consistent evidence that the threat it was protecting you from is no longer present. Providing that evidence, slowly, patiently, often with professional support, is the work of healing, not the work of becoming a different person. The work of giving the person you already are the information their nervous system needs to begin to rest. If you recognized yourself in this list, if several of these felt uncomfortably familiar, please know that recognition is not a sentence. It is a starting point, the beginning of understanding what has been running and why, and what it might need from you now. If this video named something, share it with someone who might recognize themselves in it. Take care of yourself. We'll see you in the next one.